Good morning, Faith Community Church. Today we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And this chapter is a little interesting. Paul is talking about himself, and he's talking about his apostolic authority, talking about the authority that God has given him to reach these churches. And so this is kind of Paul in his letter talking about him writing his letters to the churches. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to read it to you a little bit of this. First, I want to say in verse 1 of chapter 10, it says, "Now I, Paul, myself, appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ." So first he says the word meekness, and meekness means power under control, or if you're going to talk about, he compares this to boldness immediately after, but meekness is, Paul has authority as an apostle that God has given him to write these letters to the churches, but he's not going to overextend that authority that God has given him. He's saying that he's going to stay within those parameters. And he says in verse 2, "I beg you that when I am present, I will not need to be bold with a confidence by which I plan to challenge certain people who think we are behaving according to the flesh. For also, although we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh." And so Paul talks about the war that we wage is not against flesh and physical things, but it's against spiritual things. And that's why at Faith Community Church, we don't just teach surface issues. We don't just teach don't steal, don't covet, don't sin. That's surface stuff. Obviously, we shouldn't be doing those things, but on the flip side, we need to be teaching things that are in the heart first. We have to go deeper, just like parents. We have to go deeper with our kids in order for them to understand why we're doing what we're doing. That's why we use Scripture when we discipline them. That's why we use Scripture when we teach them about life and about the truth, as we teach them the truth of God. And so Paul is doing the same thing here, is that we are not waging a war of the flesh. There's no physical person I can fight to overcome sin. I am fighting a war of the heart. And that is, my heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? And so we're fighting against this. We're fighting against Satan and his demons, and the world is against us as well. Maybe not physically, but spiritually. That's what we're waging our war against. And so he's talking about this, about him and the people with him here. That's. As he talks about that, this is how he's putting it into that context. And so when he's talking about him writing his letters, he's talking about his authority and how God has given him this authority. And it seems like some might be questioning that, because he mentions that he plans to challenge certain people who think that him and the people he's with are behaving according to the flesh. And so in defending that, it can very easily be taken as, I'm Paul, I'm an apostle, and God has appointed me to this, and I'm going to say what I want. That's not what Paul is saying here. In fact, he spends almost this whole chapter here saying that we cannot boast in ourselves, and we can't be compared to people who boast themselves. When you boast in yourself, compare yourself to yourself, and it just amounts to nothing. And he talks about when you boast, you have to boast in the Lord, because anyone who's given authority has only been given that authority by God. Anyone who's been given any gifts, any talents, any successes, that's all been allotted by God. And so Paul explains that in this chapter. And so if you're going to boast in the Lord. That's why when somebody gives you a compliment, when somebody says, wow, that was really great of you, it's so easy for us to immediately go, yeah, I was pretty great. I was pretty cool, wasn't I? That's not the attitude that Paul is having here. Paul is saying, I am boasting in the Lord because I have the authority he's given me. Now, Paul even calls himself humble in this book, and I believe that he was like saying truth, that he was humble too. Saying the words, I am humble, it's a hard thing to say, to be humble while you're saying that, because that could be considered boasting, which is the opposite of humility. And so that's what Paul spends this whole chapter saying, that I am going to defend my apostolic authority, not because I want to keep it, not because, oh no, I'm going to lose my authority with the churches. It's God has given me this authority and you're going to respect it, not because I'm Paul and I'm anybody who's great, but because God has given me that authority. And Paul, I mean, it says throughout the New Testament here, Paul is not the greatest speaker in public. I mean, Paul is very meek. It sounds like he's very quiet, and he's not even the best looking guy, and he has physical ailments. So it's interesting because him boasting in himself wouldn't even make any sense because, compared to your average Joe person who doesn't have physical ailments and might be able to speak in public, sure, you can compare it to them, and they might look like, oh, he would be better at leading us than Paul would. That's not the point, is that God didn't give this average Joe the authority. God gave Paul this authority, and Paul is wearing it well. Paul is saying, I have this authority, and God has appointed me to this, and that's why I'm writing you these letters. That's why I can say these things with boldness, is because God has given it to me. And I'm still not going to boast in it myself. I'm going to boast in the Lord. And he's telling anyone else, if you're going to boast in anything, boast in the Lord, because God is the cause of any success, talents, skills, gifts that you have. And that's what we need to be doing. When we boast in God. Now, a couple of ways that we might be doing this today, like who walks up to someone and says, hey, I'm pretty great, in a serious manner, right? That, like, who does that? I don't really know people who do that all that often. There's some people who might, and it's very obviously boasting in themselves, and we would say, yeah, they're full of themselves. But other ways that we can do this, I mean, there's social media. There's subtle ways that we can be tooting our own horn and saying, wow, look at me, I'm pretty great, right? Instagram and TikTok are some of the biggest culprits of this, I think, of people who subtly say, hey, look at me, look how great I am. And I say those specific things because we have to be thinking about this stuff. Just because we're not saying it, going up to someone and saying, I'm so great, doesn't mean that we're not thinking that way, doesn't mean that we're not doing it. I could boast about myself to myself, which is absurd when you think about it. I could be thinking to myself, wow, I'm pretty great, aren't I? You have to do some searching. Think, are there any areas in my life where I am boasting about myself, even if it's just you thinking about it? You don't have to talk to someone else to boast about yourself. You could just be having the thoughts and being too proud, having pride that's not merited. Because everything good that you have is from God. So let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. That is 2 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll see you next time. God bless.